David West had built his family-run diner from the ground up, pouring his heart and soul into every dish, every conversation with regulars, and every small detail that made the place feel like a home. For years, the diner had been a beloved staple in the community, known for its comfort food, warm atmosphere, and friendly service. But recently, something had changed. A steady stream of negative online reviews had started to flood in, each one more disheartening than the last. Customers complained about everything from long wait times to bland food, to unfriendly service. It was a blow David hadn't seen coming, and despite his best efforts to address the concerns, the reviews kept piling up. Desperate to understand the cause of the backlash, David made a decision: he would go undercover. He would walk in as just another customer, blending in with the crowd, hoping to uncover the truth. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, he slid into one of the booths on the far side of the diner, hoping to stay unnoticed. The familiar scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeted him, but today, it felt different. The diner was quieter than usual, the hum of conversation subdued, and the energy felt off. David studied the staff as they moved through the diner. Claire, his longtime waitress, greeted a table with her usual warm smile, but something in her eyes seemed distant. She quickly moved to another table, her pace quicker than usual, almost as if she were rushing through the motions. Over by the grill, Tom, his head cook for years, looked tense as he flipped burgers with a mechanical precision that spoke volumes. There was no camaraderie in the kitchen, no laughter or joking, just the sound of sizzling meat and the clanging of pans. David's stomach twisted with concern. He had always prided himself on fostering a positive environment for his staff, but now, it was clear something had shifted. When Claire finally approached his table to take his order, she seemed distracted, almost fatigued. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone polite but lacking the usual warmth. David glanced up at her, studying her face, the lines of stress etched around her eyes. "I'll have the breakfast special, thanks," he said, keeping his voice casual, trying not to let his concern show. Claire nodded, walking away without a smile, and David's unease deepened. The food arrived quickly, but as David took a bite, he was struck by how different it tasted. The eggs were overcooked, the bacon too crispy, and the hash browns lacked the seasoning that he knew made them so popular. He tried to dismiss it as a one-time mistake, but as he looked around, he noticed that nearly every plate that came out of the kitchen was met with a similar lack of enthusiasm. Customers were poking at their meals, pushing food around with their forks, their conversations muted. There was no buzz of appreciation, no clinking of silverware in satisfaction. Even the usual regulars seemed to be eating in silence, their usual chatter reduced to murmurs. When Claire returned to refill his coffee, David couldn't help but ask, "How's everything been going here lately, Claire?" She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she poured the coffee, but she didn't meet his eyes. "It's been rough, Mr. West," she said, the words slipping out quietly, almost as if she were afraid to speak them aloud. "There's been a lot of pressure, from the management, to cut costs." David's heart sank as he realized what she was implying. The diner's beloved dishes, the ones that had built its reputation, were likely being altered to save money: less quality meat, cheaper ingredients, and smaller portions. The very heart of the diner's charm was being sacrificed for profit, and it was showing. As she finished refilling his cup, Claire added, "People can tell, Mr. West. They're noticing the difference. And they're not happy." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the frustration and helplessness she felt. David's mind raced. This was at the root of the problem. In an attempt to keep the business afloat in an increasingly competitive market, he had pushed his staff to make compromises he never should have asked for. The diner's soul, the warmth and care that had once defined it, had been lost in the name of financial survival. David sat back in his booth, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. He could feel the shift in the air. The diner was no longer the place it once was, the place where people came for comfort, for community, for a home-cooked meal. It had become just another fast food joint, offering cheap meals that satisfied only the stomach, not the soul. The realization hit him hard, and he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had put his love for the business before his love for the people who made it work: his staff, his customers, the very community that had supported him all these years. David had become so focused on surviving that he had forgotten the essence of what had made the diner thrive in the first place. As he left the booth and stood to pay, he caught Claire's eye one last time. She looked at him, a mixture of hope and weariness in her gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, as if she were grateful that he'd finally seen what was happening. David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knew what he had to do now. The diner needed more than just financial restructuring. It needed to return to its roots. It needed the care, the love, and the integrity that had made it a cornerstone of the community. David walked out of the diner that evening, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. But he also carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. He would fix this: not just the food, but the spirit of the place. It wasn't too late to bring it back, to make the diner a place people wanted to come, not because it was cheap, but because it was real. And he would make sure of that, no matter what it took. David sat in the corner booth of his diner, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, absent-mindedly stirring as the hum of conversation filled the air. It had been a long, exhausting day, one of those where everything seemed to run at a breakneck pace, and the weight of managing a business felt heavier than usual. As the owner of this small, family-run diner, he prided himself on the quality of the food, the service, and the atmosphere he'd built over the years. But lately, something had felt off. The usual steady stream of regulars seemed to dwindle, and new customers weren't returning. It didn't make sense. He'd always prided himself on the consistency of his work, on delivering a great dining experience, yet it seemed like the diner's reputation was slipping, despite his best efforts to keep it afloat. That afternoon, as he sat quietly, taking a brief break from the relentless pace of the kitchen, David overheard a conversation that would change everything. Across the room, Stephen, his manager, was sitting with two of the younger employees, Sarah and Jake. They were seated at a table near the back, but their voices carried, and though David wasn't trying to eavesdrop, the conversation they were having was impossible to ignore. Sarah's voice was the first to rise above the others, her tone sharp and full of frustration. "I don't know how much longer I can deal with this place," she said, letting out an exasperated sigh. "The way he runs this diner, always demanding perfection, pushing us to meet ridiculous expectations, it's too much. He doesn't even notice what's going on in the back. It's all about the numbers, and we're the ones left to pick up the slack." Jake nodded in agreement, his voice low but laced with irritation. "Yeah, I mean, we're doing the best we can, but it's not enough. You try working a double shift with barely any help, and then the pressure to keep things running smoothly. Something's got to give. So, what do we do? Cut corners. A little less care in the prep, skip a few steps here and there. The customers won't notice, right?" David's heart sank, and his grip tightened around his coffee cup, his mind racing as he processed their words. He had always tried to create a supportive and professional environment for his staff, pushing them to take pride in their work and to offer customers the best service possible. But the reality of what he was hearing now was devastating. His employees, his trusted staff, the ones he had relied on to help run the diner, were talking about sabotaging the very standards he had worked so hard to maintain. They were openly admitting to cutting corners, to delivering less than ideal service, all to cope with the pressure he, unknowingly, had put on them. Sarah's next words hit David harder than any criticism he had ever received. "And then Stephen just covers for us," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "He doesn't care as long as we're getting the orders out." But honestly, I don't think he even believes in what David's trying to do here. It's not like he's a big fan of the way he runs things, either. The betrayal was suffocating. David had trusted Stephen. He had thought of him as a reliable manager, someone who understood the vision for the diner and helped guide the team. But to hear that Stephen was complicit in the sabotage, that he had allowed this behavior to fester rather than address it, crushed him. All at once, David felt a wave of emotions: anger, disappointment, hurt. He had never imagined his staff would be the source of the diner's decline. He had always thought the challenge came from outside competition, changing customer expectations, the pressures of running a small business. But now, he realized that the rot was coming from within, from the very people who had been entrusted to uphold the diner's reputation. He felt disillusioned, but at the same time, a part of him understood. The diner had been struggling for months, and the pressure had clearly taken its toll on his employees. Perhaps they felt overworked, unsupported, or undervalued. Maybe they had been so overwhelmed by the demands of the job that they saw shortcuts as the only way to cope. And yet, despite this understanding, the reality was still painful. David had poured his heart into this diner. It wasn't just a business, it was his passion, his livelihood, his dream. To have that dream chipped away by the very people he had trusted with it felt like a betrayal on a level he couldn't quite process. He took a slow breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his head, and for a moment, he considered leaving the booth, confronting them, putting an end to it right then and there. But no, that wasn't his way. David knew he couldn't confront them in anger. He needed to approach this carefully, thoughtfully, and above all, with the understanding that the situation was a reflection of larger issues. He would have to address the underlying problems, rebuild the trust that had been fractured, and re-establish the values that had once made his diner a place customers loved. As he sat there, the weight of the realization sinking in, David made a silent promise to himself. The road ahead would be difficult. But he would fix this. He would rebuild not only the diner's reputation but also the bond with his staff. It wouldn't be easy, but if he was going to save the business he had built, he had to start by looking inward, by understanding where he had gone wrong and what needed to change. The conversation continued to echo in his ears as David stood up and walked toward the kitchen, his resolve hardening. The first step had been taken. Now, it was time to take control of the diner's future, one decision at a time. David had always prided himself on his business, pouring his heart and soul into every decision, believing that if he worked hard enough, everything would fall into place. But as he stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching from a distance, a sinking feeling began to take root in his chest. It was supposed to be the beating heart of his restaurant, the place where passion and precision came together to create the dishes that had once earned his place in the community. But what he saw now was anything but that. The kitchen, once filled with the sound of focused activity and the sharp clatter of knives, had descended into chaos. The floor was littered with forgotten food scraps, the counters cluttered with half-prepared ingredients, and the air, once redolent with the rich scents of freshly cooked meals, now carried a faint odor of stale oil and neglect. Behind the line, the cooks moved with a sluggishness that seemed foreign to him. Instead of sharp, efficient movements, there was a hesitance, a lack of urgency. The uniforms that had once been crisp and professional were now wrinkled, stained, and ill-fitting. One of the cooks was idly leaning against the counter, joking with a fellow employee while another shuffled through the fridge, not paying attention to the order tickets piling up. The scene struck David like a punch to the gut. His stomach tightened as he watched them laugh, unaware or perhaps uncaring of the impact their inattention was having on the restaurant's reputation. He had heard the complaints from customers, but he had brushed them aside, convincing himself it was just the occasional dissatisfied patron. Yet, as he watched the scene unfold in front of him, it became clear, the complaints weren't isolated. They were symptoms of a much deeper problem. The quality of the food had slipped, no doubt about it. The once pristine presentation of each plate had been replaced with dishes that looked hurried and thrown together. The flavors, too, had changed. Meals that used to impress with their richness and depth now tasted bland, and every time a dish left the kitchen, David could see the disappointment in the eyes of the waiting staff. It hit him all at once, this wasn't just a matter of a few off days. This was a direct result of how the kitchen was being run or, more accurately, how it wasn't being run at all. The lack of care, the sloppy preparation, the disregard for the craft, it was all there, right in front of him. And it wasn't just affecting the food. It was infecting everything: the service, the atmosphere, and ultimately, the reputation he had worked so hard to build. David felt a pang of guilt wash over him. How had he let this happen? He had been so focused on the front of the house, on managing customers and keeping up with the business side of things, that he had neglected the very core of what made the restaurant successful, the kitchen. He had trusted his team, yes, but had he really been watching closely enough? Had he been blind to the gradual erosion of standards, believing that the team would just take care of things on their own? The realization was hard to swallow. His restaurant, his dream, was crumbling from the inside out, and it had taken him this long to see it. As he watched one of the cooks lazily flicking through his phone between tasks, David's frustration boiled over, but there was no anger in it, just deep disappointment. This wasn't about firing people or assigning blame. It was about the fact that somewhere along the line, the passion that had driven this place had been replaced with complacency. And if he didn't act soon, it would all be lost. He turned to walk away, but as he did, his eyes lingered on the kitchen again, and something inside him shifted. There was still hope. The kitchen was not beyond saving, it just needed a new direction, a renewed commitment to the values that had once made it thrive. His dream hadn't been destroyed, it had just been neglected, like an old recipe forgotten in the back of a drawer. David knew that it was time for a change. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But he couldn't sit back and watch his business falter. His customers deserved better, and so did his team. With a deep breath, he resolved to make it right. The first step would be to gather his staff, to have an honest conversation about what had been happening in the kitchen, and to remind them of why they had come to work at this restaurant in the first place, because they loved food, because they cared about the craft, and because they wanted to be part of something special. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He would need to rebuild the trust, inspire the passion that had once made the kitchen hum with energy, and hold himself and his team accountable. The kitchen wasn't just a room full of stoves and ovens, it was the soul of his restaurant, and it was time to reignite that spark. As David walked away from the kitchen, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This revelation had hit him hard, but it was a turning point, one that would shape the future of his business. There was still time to turn things around, and he would fight for it, no matter how hard it might be. After all, a business is only as strong as its foundation, and for David, that foundation would always begin in the kitchen. David stood in the doorway of the diner, his jaw clenched and his heart pounding, the weight of what he was about to do settling in his chest like a stone. For months, he had watched from the shadows, not as a passive observer, but as someone who had entrusted everything to the people in front of him, his employees, his team, the very people who had once seemed like family. Yet, now, it was impossible to ignore the signs of betrayal that had been festering in the corners of his business, the stolen tips, the corner cutting, the poor treatment of customers. David had kept quiet for far too long, hoping that things would improve on their own, but today, he had reached his breaking point. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt: he was the owner. It was his responsibility to preserve the integrity of the diner, to ensure that the trust placed in him by his father and his community wasn't violated by the actions of those he had considered loyal. Taking a deep breath, David stepped forward into the heart of the diner, where the staff milled around, exchanging whispered jokes and preparing for another evening shift. Their chatter stopped abruptly as he spoke, his voice calm but steady, belying the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I'm David," he began, his eyes sweeping over the group, "and I've been watching everything." The words landed with a thud, silencing the room. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, the air thick with disbelief and confusion. Stephen, the manager, froze, his expression shifting from smug confidence to something akin to panic. He opened his mouth, probably to protest, but David cut him off with a single, unwavering glance. "You've all betrayed my trust," David continued, his voice quiet but cutting through the thick tension like a knife. "I've seen how you've treated the customers, how you've sabotaged the quality of work in exchange for personal gain. I'm not angry, I'm hurt." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion, and for a moment, David thought he might choke on them. How had it come to this? How had the people he'd employed, the ones who had shared his vision of the diner's success, turned into people he could no longer trust? The silence that followed was palpable, each staff member looking away, unable to meet his gaze, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. The defensiveness in the room grew quickly, as if they were all desperately trying to shield themselves from the truth. "You can't possibly think this is fair," Stephen muttered, stepping forward, his voice tied with a mixture of guilt and indignation. "You don't know what it's been like here. You don't see how hard we work." David's eyes never left him, and he took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "I know exactly what it's like here, Stephen. But it's not about hard work. It's about integrity. It's about respect for me, for the customers, and for this place." The crew shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, some with defensiveness, others with shame. David could see the cracks in their armor. Their denial of the truth they had allowed themselves to live with for so long was breaking down, but they were still holding on to the fragile illusion that they were in the right. The betrayal was as much about their disrespect for the diner as it was about their disregard for the commitment they had made to him when he first opened the doors. He had trusted them, but trust was a fragile thing. "The future of this diner depends on your willingness to change," David said, his voice suddenly sharp with authority. "You've crossed a line, and there will be consequences. But there's still time to make things right." His words were clear, not an ultimatum, but a statement of fact. This was the fork in the road. It was up to them whether they would take responsibility or continue down the path of dishonesty. The room felt colder now, the truth settling over them like a shroud. As David stood there, his heart still heavy with disappointment, he saw the cracks in the facade of their bravado. For the first time, the staff was truly listening. They weren't hearing threats or anger, they were hearing the hurt of someone who had given them everything: his trust, his vision, and his livelihood, and had watched them let it slip away. The silence stretched on, each second more agonizing than the last, but David refused to back down. His resolve had never been clearer. "You can choose to be a part of this diner's future, or you can walk away," he said, his tone firm, yet laced with a quiet sadness. "But whatever you choose, know that I won't tolerate betrayal, not from any of you." As the last of his words hung in the air, the room seemed to shift. Some staff members looked at each other in uneasy realization, others at the ground, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. There was no easy fix, no quick resolution, but for the first time in a long while, David felt as if he was no longer alone in his struggle. His eyes met Stephen's once more, no longer the manager he had once relied on, but a man caught in the consequences of his own choices. The future of the diner, David realized, was not just about the food or the service, it was about the people who ran it. And the changes that were coming, no matter how hard they might be, would be for the better. David had no illusions. This was just the beginning. But as he stood there, waiting for their response, he knew that whatever came next, he had taken the first, necessary step toward restoring the dignity and integrity of the diner he had worked so hard to build. The dim light of the diner flickered overhead as Stephen stood at the front, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his words, trying to explain himself, though the apology was barely a whisper beneath the layers of excuses. "You don't understand, David," Stephen said, his voice low but tinged with frustration. "The stress of running this place, it's been suffocating. The bills, the late nights, trying to keep up with the competition. Sometimes, cutting corners felt like the only way to keep things going. I had to do it just to survive." His gaze shifted downward, avoiding eye contact, as if the truth of his actions was finally sinking in. He could feel the room's tension, the eyes of the employees burning into him, their discomfort palpable. The clattering of plates had stopped, the hum of the kitchen quieted. Every person in the diner had been touched by the consequences of Stephen's decisions, and now the air felt thick with regret. David stood on the other side of the counter, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had listened to the excuses, the justifications, but they weren't enough. His disappointment was heavy in his chest, a weight that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to understand Stephen's position. The diner, once a community, a place where everyone felt welcome and valued, had now become a reflection of the cracks beneath its surface, cracks that Stephen had ignored in his effort to keep it afloat. As Stephen finished speaking, the silence in the room grew deeper, and for a moment, David didn't know what to say. His mind raced through the years of trust, the sacrifices the team had made together, and the countless customers who had walked through the door, unaware of the shortcuts that had been taken behind the scenes. The truth of the situation hit him like a wave. What Stephen had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal of the people who believed in the diner and in him. His employees, those same people who had been impacted by the corners Stephen had cut, began to speak up, their voices trembling with guilt. One by one, they offered apologies, each of them sharing how they, too, had contributed to the atmosphere that had allowed these compromises to continue. "I should have said something sooner," said Mark, the cook, his eyes downcast. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I thought we were just managing. I didn't know we were losing our way." Another employee, Sarah, who worked the front counter, nodded in agreement. I didn't want to rock the boat. I just wanted to keep my job, but I see now that we've been letting things slide. I'm sorry, David. There were more apologies, each one heartfelt but each carrying the weight of a deeper realization that what had started as small compromises had grown into a culture of negligence. It wasn't just Stephen who had lost sight of the diner's core values, it was everyone who had allowed it to happen. But amidst the apologies, there was something else, something that David had been hoping to see all along. The realization that his team had woken up, that they understood the gravity of the situation and were ready to own their part in it. Despite the bitterness in his chest, David felt a flicker of hope. He listened, not just to the words of apology, but to the sincerity in their voices, and for the first time in what felt like months, he believed in their potential to turn things around. He stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. I'm upset, Stephen. I'm upset because this diner has always meant more than just a business to me. It's been a place where people come together, where we've built something we can all be proud of. But you've put all of that at risk. You've made choices that hurt not only the business but the people who work here. Stephen opened his mouth to speak, but David held up a hand. But I'm not here to tear you down, or to point fingers at everyone. What's done is done. We all have our part in this. But what I do believe, what I know, is that we can fix it. We've all made mistakes, but I believe in this team. I believe in all of you. His words weren't just a lifeline for Stephen, but for everyone in that room who had quietly feared the damage was irreversible. There was a long pause, the weight of David's conviction settling over the group like a warm light breaking through the fog. David wasn't letting anyone off the hook, not Stephen, not himself, and certainly not the employees, but he wasn't giving up on them either. His belief in the team, in their ability to do better, to be better, was the spark they needed. The room, which had once felt heavy with regret, began to breathe again. The apologies weren't a sign of weakness, they were the first steps toward rebuilding. Stephen's face softened, his shoulders slackening, as if the weight of the moment had finally cracked his hardened exterior. He wasn't perfect, he knew that, but in that moment, he saw that redemption wasn't beyond reach. It would take work. It would take humility. But they had a chance. I'm sorry, David. I've let you down, Stephen finally said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. David nodded, his voice filled with quiet resolve. We'll all do what it takes. Together. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something new, the beginning of honesty, accountability, and a shared commitment to make the diner what it had always been meant to be, a place where everyone mattered, and where everyone had a role in shaping its future. David stood in the middle of his diner, surrounded by the bustling sounds of orders being called out and dishes clattering, but the weight of the past weeks hung heavy on his shoulders. He had watched as his staff, once full of energy and passion, had become weary and disengaged. The enthusiasm that had initially fueled the diner's success had slowly eroded under the pressure of long hours, chaotic shifts, and a lack of direction. The turnover rate was high, morale was low, and customer complaints were mounting. Something had to change, and David knew it had to start with him. He couldn't keep going on like this, running the business on autopilot, hoping things would get better. No, it was time to take real action, time to lead in a way that inspired not just the bottom line but the people behind the counters. That morning, after his usual coffee and a quiet moment of reflection, he decided to implement changes immediately. He called for a staff meeting that afternoon, and when everyone gathered, the atmosphere in the room was filled with uncertainty. The crew was used to the routine, but not used to hearing their boss speak so seriously about the future. David stood at the front, looking each of them in the eye, and spoke with a quiet determination that left no room for doubt. "We're changing things. Not just for the business, but for all of us," he began. "We've been stuck in a cycle for too long. I'm going to implement staff training to make sure each of you feels equipped to handle your role with confidence. We're revisiting our policies, rethinking how we approach customer service, and most importantly, we're going to make sure we're creating a culture where stress doesn't overwhelm us, but where we support one another through it." He paused, letting his words sink in. There were murmurs among the staff, some nodding, others unsure of what to make of it. David knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. He wasn't asking them to work harder, he was asking them to work smarter, together. Over the next few days, David rolled out the changes. First, he brought in an expert to offer the team training on stress management, time management, and communication. He wanted them to understand that they were not just workers in a fast-paced environment, but an integral part of a team that had the power to shape the diner's success. Slowly, the team began to adjust, learning new ways to handle pressure and communicate more effectively with one another. The new policies David put in place, ranging from more realistic shift schedules to creating more efficient systems for food prep and service, immediately began to ease the burdens that had weighed down his staff for so long. It wasn't just about making things easier, it was about making sure every team member felt supported, valued, and respected in their role. David's commitment to improvement didn't stop with training. He spent hours revisiting the diner's goals, making sure they were aligned with the values he wanted to instill in the team. He focused on creating a positive work environment where feedback was welcomed, where mistakes were seen as opportunities for growth, and where everyone's input was considered important. As the days turned into weeks, the changes began to take root in ways David hadn't fully expected. The staff, once skeptical, started to see the positive effects of the new approach. With the pressure lifted and a renewed sense of purpose, they began to take ownership of their roles. Servers smiled more, taking pride in the way they interacted with customers. Cooks moved with greater efficiency, preparing dishes with care and attention to detail. The dishwashers worked with more energy, no longer feeling like invisible cogs in the machine. The entire team began to act as if they were part of something bigger than just a job. They were part of a mission to make the diner the best it could be. Customers noticed the shift, too. The atmosphere was warmer, the service smoother, and the food consistently better. Positive reviews began to flood in, but more importantly, regular customers began to come back, not just for the meals but for the experience. David watched, his heart swelling with pride, as the diner began to thrive once more. It wasn't just the increase in sales that mattered, it was the energy, the transformation of the team from a group of tired, disheartened individuals into a unified, motivated crew that was proud of what they were creating. One evening, as David watched the crew working together like a well-oiled machine, he realized something profound. It wasn't the diner's success he was most proud of, it was the growth of his team, the way they had come together, transformed, and taken responsibility for the diner's culture. He saw the confidence in their eyes now, the way they held their heads high, knowing their hard work and efforts had created something worthwhile. The diners were no longer just showing up for the food, they were coming back because they felt something genuine, something personal in the way the staff made them feel welcome. David knew this was only the beginning. There would be more hurdles to overcome, more adjustments to make, but for the first time in a long while, he believed that the changes he had made had planted seeds of lasting success. The diner wasn't just a business anymore, it was a reflection of the people behind it, and together, they had built something they could all be proud of. As David sat alone in his office, the hum of the afternoon settled around him, a rare stillness that allowed his mind to wander back over the past few months. The changes he had fought for, the long hours spent drafting new policies, the countless meetings and conversations that had shifted the company's culture, all of it had led to this moment of reflection. At first, it had been hard to admit just how much he didn't know about the true workings of his own company. For years, he had operated under the assumption that as long as the numbers were right and deadlines were met, the company was running smoothly. He had focused on the macro, the big picture, overseeing high-level strategies and long-term goals. But it wasn't until Emily's departure that the cracks in the foundation had become impossible to ignore. Her resignation, and the silent suffering that had led to it, had forced David to confront the reality that he had been out of touch with the very people who made his business run, the employees. The weight of their exhaustion, frustration, and disillusionment had not been something he could see from his high perch. And it wasn't just about policies or benefits or pay, it was about a deep, cultural problem. He had learned that a company's success wasn't just measured by profits or growth charts, but by the trust and well-being of the people who contributed every day. David had been disconnected, relying too heavily on others to handle the internal dynamics without fully understanding the emotional and psychological impact that the work environment was having on his employees. What followed Emily's resignation was a cascade of realizations. A good leader wasn't just reactive, they were proactive. It wasn't enough to wait for things to break down before stepping in. Leadership required an active engagement with the heart of the company, the culture, the day-to-day struggles, and the people behind the work. It took real listening, deep empathy, and the willingness to make difficult, sometimes unpopular decisions for the greater good. In the weeks that followed, David had worked tirelessly alongside his team to implement the changes they knew were necessary. Employee benefits were overhauled, mental health support programs were introduced, and wages were reviewed and adjusted to reflect the true value of their employees' contributions. But it wasn't just the policies that changed, it was the way the company began to feel. There was a shift in the air, a new energy that pulsed through the offices. Employees who had once seemed distant or disengaged began to open up, sharing their ideas, their concerns, their experiences. David had been shocked by how much he had overlooked, how many voices had gone unheard for so long. He began to recognize that leadership wasn't about standing apart, detached and above the noise. It was about being in the trenches with your people, understanding their challenges, and doing the work to make their lives better. As he thought back to those first, uncomfortable days of change, he realized just how transformative the experience had been for him. He had been forced to grow, to expand beyond the role of a CEO or a business leader, into someone who understood the weight of his decisions and the impact they had on the lives of those who worked for him. This experience had fundamentally altered the way he viewed his responsibilities. No longer would he be content to sit behind closed doors, making decisions without context or connection to the people they affected. The value of being connected to the day-to-day workings of the business had never been clearer. David now saw firsthand the importance of fostering a healthy work culture. It wasn't just about offering perks or benefits, it was about creating an environment where employees felt safe, supported, and empowered to do their best work. It was about trust, transparency, and accountability. It was about making sure that no one felt like they had to carry the weight of the job alone, that no one was ever left behind. As David reflected on the lessons he had learned, he thought about Emily, who had unknowingly been the catalyst for all the changes that had taken place. She had sparked something deeper than just policy shifts, she had sparked a shift in his own understanding of leadership. He owed her more than just gratitude, he owed her the acknowledgement that her courage in stepping forward had set into motion the changes that would ultimately benefit so many others. But there was still work to be done. David understood that the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. Change, after all, wasn't a destination but a continuous process. He couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, but he could ensure that they wouldn't be repeated. He could continue to learn, continue to listen, and continue to evolve as a leader, someone who truly understood the power of trust, the importance of connection, and the deep responsibility that came with the role. His mind shifted from reflection to action, knowing that he had to keep pushing for the future, for the employees who had put their trust in him, for the company that could now stand proudly on the foundation of respect, empathy, and growth. David took a deep breath, looking out the window at the bustling city below, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The changes were just the beginning, and he was ready to lead them into the future, with his eyes, heart, and mind wide open. Leadership, he now understood, was not about standing at the top, but about walking alongside your team, every step of the way. As the weeks passed, the diner that had once been a place of tension and disarray began to transform before everyone's eyes, thanks to David's decision to confront the underlying issues head-on. When the struggles of miscommunication, low morale, and declining quality had plagued the establishment, it had felt as though the diner was on the brink of collapse, a far cry from the bustling hub it once was. But David, refusing to let his dream falter, recognized that the only way to turn things around was through transparency, honesty, and a willingness to rebuild the trust that had been lost between him and his staff. He called a meeting, not as a boss, but as a leader, admitting his own shortcomings and listening intently to the frustrations of his team. The dialogue that followed was uncomfortable at times, but it was necessary. For the first time in months, employees felt heard, and that simple act of listening sparked a change in the atmosphere. The diner's revival didn't happen overnight, but slowly, day by day, David's efforts started to pay off. The service quality, once marred by mistakes and lack of enthusiasm, began to improve. The team, once fractured and wary, now operated as a more cohesive unit. They weren't just going through the motions, they were genuinely caring for the work they did and the customers they served. The energy in the kitchen became more positive, as the staff, feeling supported and appreciated, worked with renewed purpose. The once negative atmosphere that had hovered over the diner began to dissipate, replaced by laughter, camaraderie, and a collective sense of pride. The customers noticed the change too. As the quality of food improved and the service became more efficient, positive reviews began to flood in, many praising the new warmth and professionalism that the diner now radiated. Word spread quickly, and the diner, once on the edge of losing its reputation, started to attract more regulars and curious new faces eager to see for themselves what had sparked the turnaround. For David, the most gratifying part of the recovery was seeing his team come together. The staff, many of whom had been disillusioned and discouraged, now worked with a renewed sense of commitment and energy. They had learned to trust one another again, to communicate openly, and to support each other in ways that went beyond mere professional obligation. It was no longer just about serving food, it was about serving each other and the community that had supported them through thick and thin. David, once burdened by the weight of his decisions, now walked through the diner with a sense of pride. He had not only saved the business, but he had also built a foundation of mutual respect and trust that would serve as the backbone for years to come. The road to recovery had been far from easy, and the challenges were real, but David's choice to confront the problems openly and honestly had given the diner a new life, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. It was no longer just a place to work, it was a place to grow, to share in successes, and to learn from mistakes. The diner had been reborn, not just through improved service or better food, but through a shift in mindset. The staff no longer felt like cogs in a machine but valued contributors to a shared vision. They had learned that in order to move forward, they had to face the hard truths and work together to heal the wounds that had once divided them. This sense of unity became their greatest strength, fueling their determination to continue improving every day. As the diner's reputation grew, so did the pride each team member took in their work. The compliments from customers were no longer just about the food, they were about the experience, the feeling of being welcomed and taken care of, and the positive energy that now filled the air. And for David, watching his staff thrive and seeing the once struggling business flourish, it was a powerful reminder of why he had chosen to fight for the diner in the first place. It wasn't just about profits, it was about creating a space where people felt valued and connected. The recovery wasn't just a business turnaround, it was a testament to the power of leadership, vulnerability, and the strength of a team united by a common purpose. David's decision to take responsibility, to confront the difficulties head-on, and to trust in his team had not only healed the diner but had also transformed it into a place that people could be proud of. The road to recovery was long, but every step, every decision, and every act of trust had been worth it. The diner, now thriving with positive energy, stood as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no matter how tough the challenges may be, with openness, commitment, and teamwork, any setback can be overcome. David had always poured his heart into the diner. It wasn't just a business to him, it was an extension of his values, integrity, accountability, and teamwork. When he first opened the doors, he was filled with optimism, eager to build a space where great food and great service went hand in hand. But reality had been harsher than he expected. The diner struggled at first, plagued by poor service, disorganization, and a lack of focus among his staff. The mistakes they made were numerous, and the stress of keeping the business afloat often weighed heavily on David. He watched as his dreams seemed to slip through his fingers, and at times, he questioned whether the diner would ever succeed. Yet, instead of giving up, David chose to face the challenges head-on. He realized that his team needed more than just direction, they needed guidance, trust, and a sense of ownership in the success of the business. It was a hard lesson, but he learned that leadership was not just about giving orders, it was about listening, understanding, and empowering his staff to be better. He began holding regular team meetings where every voice mattered, where they could discuss the challenges they faced and come up with solutions together. David shared his vision of the diner as a place where accountability wasn't just expected, but embraced. Slowly, things began to shift. Staff who once seemed disengaged or apathetic started to show up with a new energy. They began taking pride in their work, whether it was ensuring each dish was prepared perfectly, greeting customers with genuine warmth, or making sure the restaurant ran smoothly behind the scenes. The diners who once walked in with skepticism now left with smiles, knowing they'd experienced something special. Word spread about the change at the diner, how the service was faster, friendlier, and more attentive, and how the food was always consistently delicious. David didn't just want to run a business, he wanted to build a community. The staff's transformation was a testament to the power of teamwork and the belief that when people feel valued and supported, they can achieve incredible things. David made sure to celebrate their successes, both big and small, because he knew that recognition was the fuel that kept the fire of motivation burning. As the diner began to thrive, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The challenges they had faced, the sleepless nights, the tough conversations, the moments when it seemed like they were on the brink of failure had made the team stronger, more resilient, and more committed to the mission. The diner was no longer just a reflection of David's dream, but of everyone's hard work, perseverance, and shared vision. He had created a culture where integrity was at the core of every action, where accountability wasn't something forced but embraced, and where teamwork wasn't just a word on a poster but a living, breathing part of the everyday experience. The change that David had hoped for was no longer a distant aspiration, it was his reality. Looking around the diner now, he saw a team that believed in each other, that held each other to high standards, and that cared about the success of the business as much as he did. The pride on their faces was unmistakable, and in those moments, David knew that the diner had become something much more than a place to eat. It had become a family, united in their goal to provide the best experience for every customer. The future was no longer uncertain. It was bright. David felt a sense of accomplishment not only for the success they had achieved but for the lessons learned along the way. He had transformed a struggling business into a thriving one, not through shortcuts or compromises, but through hard work, perseverance, and a commitment to the values he held dear. The journey had been long and difficult, but the rewards were worth every ounce of effort. The diner was now a place of pride, not just for David but for everyone who worked there. As they looked ahead, they knew that the road would still have its challenges, but they were no longer afraid. With a foundation built on trust, respect, and a shared vision, they were ready to take on whatever the future held. David's heart swelled with gratitude as he looked around at his staff, knowing that this was just the beginning. Their collective success was a testament to the power of teamwork, integrity, and accountability. The diner had become more than just a business, it was a place where people found purpose, where dreams were nurtured, and where the spirit of collaboration could thrive. In the end, David realized that the diner had not only become stronger as a business, it had become stronger as a community, a place where people didn't just work together, they grew together. And that was a legacy he would carry forward with pride.